Welcome to the GEI Lecture Series. We are very pleased to welcome Professor Catherine Boone from the London School of present book. So Cathy is currently the Harold Laski Professor of Physical Science with a joint professor in International Development at LSE, previously Professor of Government at the University of Texas at Austin, and has also been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2020, and also the Fellow of the British Academy in 2021. And this is her fourth book, all of which are in the very prestigious Comparative Politics series at Cambridge University Press. And from flicking through the back material of the list of authors, I'm pretty sure you're the only person. There's 4 monographs on that book series, which is quite a claim to fame, I would say. But yeah, Cathy over many years has been done some really extensive and enormously influential work on politics of African states, African development, and particularly around the role of institutions and the role of production systems in shaping African politics. And so, with that in mind, I will hand over to you for about 45 minutes or so, and we'll have some time for Q&A.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I mean, it just kind of goes to show also the premium on perseverance. Like, if you just keep at it long enough, you accumulate writings. So I want to thank you all, and especially Tom, for inviting me back to Manchester to give this lecture. I was here 5 years ago, and I talked on the same project. And so at first I kind of hesitated about whether I should come back or not. Tom said, no, you should come back now that this time had passed. And it was really interesting for me to go back to what I had presented 5 years ago and where this particular project ended up. And one thing that I noticed, which is very nice, the kind of wraparound is, I did draw a lot on the people in this research institute, drew a lot on the work on African politics by Sam Hickey and Tom Lavers and others to kind of round out the analysis in the book. And so there's a lot of here and a lot of this place in this project. So that makes it sort of doubly nice to come back. I would try to at least touch on some of those threads, and maybe we can do so also in the Q&A. So to frame this presentation, I would like to start with a vignette. And it's a vignette that comes from Kenya, where I was recently last month in September. And the thing about this story is that it just kind of contains all the elements of the talk. So somehow this vignette is the answer to the research question that I'm going to pose. So let me tell you this story. So this is the story of the rise and fall of the deputy president of Kenya, Rigathi Gachagua, who was just impeached 1 or 2 weeks ago from his job. So the rise and fall of Gachagua. So this Rigathi Gachagua ran in 2022 as the running mate of William Ruto, who was kind of, in his long story, sort of an upstart contender. But Ruto's power base is in the Rift Valley region of Kenya, and he selected Rigathi Gachagua to bring along the former central province of Kenya, the Mount Kenya region, to bring Mount Kenya region into the coalition between these two heavyweight provinces in Kenyan politics. So Rigathi Gachagua's mission was to deliver Mount Kenya region. And to make it possible for Gachagua to win the votes of the Mount Kenya region, Ruto gave Gachagua the coffee dossier. So coffee reforms had been brewing in Kenya for about 5 years. This is a coffee-producing region, the former Central Province region, the Mount Kenya region. produces most of Kenya's coffee, long delayed reform. So Ruto promised that if the ticket were elected, his ticket were elected, Gachagua would be in charge of delivering the coffee reforms to this major coffee producing region. So Gachagua toured around Mount Kenya region, sort of meeting with the leaders of cooperatives, meeting with coffee farmers, laying out the promises of what he would do for the coffee sector. And when the ticket between Ruto and Gachagua won the election in 2022, the region celebrated because indeed Gachagua undertook to put the promised reforms into practice. So within about a year and a half, there was perhaps predictably a falling out between the president and the deputy president. And Gachagua was accused of trying to build his own empire in the Mount Kenya Central Province region and to use that as a base to launch his own bid for power. So one of the or perhaps one of the most controversial things that Gachagua did was promote this argument about the importance of reforming Kenya's national revenue allocation formula for tax redistribution. So under the 2010 Constitution, they adopted, let's say, a kind of progressive formula that gave a sort of extra bonus to the lagging regions of Kenya, the poorest regions of Kenya. So what Gachagua did in his campaign and one of his big bids for power was to say this needed to be revised, and that the most important, the most populous, and the richest regions of Kenya should get more. It should be 1 person, 1 shilling, 1 vote. The richest regions should get more because they contribute more. And the lagging regions justifiably recognized that this was an attack on the kind of affirmative action redistribution formula that had been enshrined in the Constitution. So this slide this is just obviously news clips. So there's Rigathi in the center. Here he is on the top, a headline, Mount Kenya Supremo. So Mount Kenya is a region. It corresponds to the former Central Province, which is a multi-ethnic region, just like the Rift Valley region, which is the power base of President Ruto, is multi-ethnic. And so here you see he campaigns for Mount Kenya unity, the unity of the region, but is later then sort of the tables are turned and he's blamed for that blamed for promoting divisiveness, regional divisiveness at the national level. And here's another headline, task force, delivers these coffee sector reforms. So indeed, the tables are turned on Gachagua, and a couple of weeks ago, he was indeed impeached. The president engineers this sort of massive coalition against him, and now I guess he's in the political wilderness. So these are the elements of the Gachagua story to retain. And as I said, this is kind of like the answer to the research question that I'm getting asked. And so the first point is this drama of regional competition within Kenya. A regional alliance brings his ticket to power, and then it's Gachagua sort of fighting to impose the supremacy of Mount Kenya region and his new bid for power, revising the old constitutional revenue distribution formula, etc., on a regional basis. So Rigathi Gachagua comes from the richest and most populous region, and is historically in power in Kenya. I think they say 70% of the elections since independence have put a leader from Central Province or the Mount Kenya region into power. So this interlude now with Ruto is somewhat anomalous in that regard, but he comes from this rich and most populous region, and indeed made his claim to revise the revenue allocation formula on that basis. So we see in this case also the high salience in electoral politics of this geographically targeted sectoral policy, the coffee dossier. So Gachagua in charge of coffee, this is supposed to be his sort of magic ticket to win the region, and he did indeed directly ride that to power. And then we have the divisiveness of the national regional allocation formula as one that sort of fuels a flame of alarm outside of the Mount Kenya region, alarm at what was described by some as the power grab of the vice president. So this is just a story, and I would like to come back to these pieces of the story as I kind of tell you what, lay out this larger argument. So now back to the beginning. Just hold those thoughts. So back to the beginning. So I did this project starting about 5 or 6 years ago, as I said, around this motivating question or puzzle. So the motivating puzzle was economic inequalities are so extreme in African countries compared to, on their own, but even compared to other world regions. They're very extreme, but how does this shape politics, or how do we see any of the expected or predicted political effects, or how does this play out in national politics? So, we expect this to be quite salient. So much to work in political science, my discipline, said that socioeconomic cleavages are really not what politics in African countries are about. So, the class-based cleavage argument has long been kind of put aside in the African politics literature. So I know we do see, in kind of at the subnational level, some class-based politics, but at the national level, still no one is arguing, or everyone is still comfortable with this argument that this is not class-based politics when we look at most African countries. And most scholars have defaulted to these other arguments. So the authoritarian model, where there's a small elite that can kind of conspiring and maneuvering amongst themselves to exploit the mass. So that's a staple. Of course, the ethnic politics model, that if there are any social cleavages, they arise out of the ethnicities, the ethnic politics, that's really what politics are about. And then, another sort of one that tries to be more geographic, but this idea of Herbst, Jeff Herbst, States and Power, this kind of idea that, there's kind of an urban core, or sort of an urban core, an urban elite that sort of commands politics, and then there's this kind of vast, flat periphery of, ungoverned spaces, which is still an idea that has retained captured the imagination, we could say, of many scholars in political science and in econ. So in this project, I try to give a different answer to this question. And the answer is, as you may have anticipated already, the answer is that in many or most African countries, the salient cleavages at the national level are really regional. It's region that is the salient cleavage, and that this is what goes far in structuring competition at the national political level. So regions formed around multi-ethnic regions formed at basically the provincial level, colonial era provinces, and that the regions exist in a hierarchical relationship to each other, economically speaking. So there are rich regions and poor regions, and the rich regions are really the main actors, collective actors in national politics. So the favored regions, or the more advantaged regions, maybe a better way of putting it, the most economically advantaged regions sort of dominate the political game. Usually in power, dominate the political game. So this is where the inequality business comes in. So hierarchical relationship to each other. So that's the first main argument. So this regional differentiation comes from these processes of national economic integration, or a building of a national economy in economies that are deeply integrated into the global economy, largely through their export sectors. So this is the kind of uneven development that comes from countries that were incorporated into the global economy in the, mostly the 20th century under colonial rule, mainly through their export sectors. So this kind of uneven development that we talk about all the time produces this uneven geography of leading and lagging regions, and puts these regions, as I argue, in competitive relationship with each other. So that's a second move. And then the third argument, drawing on work in political science, is that institutions really matter also in accentuating this kind of regional organization of politics, and that coalescing of leading regions as actors at the national level. So this part of the argument refers to the territorial grid of the state, the grid of provinces and districts, which I argue, and I'll develop that point a little bit, which I argue emerged around this uneven economic geography of export-producing regions and indeed lagging regions. So this uneven economic geography is strongly territorial. So we know also that the territorial administration is not only provinces but also districts under colonial rule, the native authorities, the land tenure regimes, the ethnicization, etc., is nested within this geography of uneven economic development. So I make those points and then finally try to come to this point at the end that this kind of regionalism is not only just observable as a kind of inert fact, but that we see the regionalism shaping policy debates in African countries around the canonical issues that evoke or that set in motion regional competition in regionally unequal, territorially divided countries all over the world, not only African countries, but elsewhere. So policy discussions around redistribution, just where we would expect to see sectoral policy, of course, national market integration, leading and lagging regions, and the canonical problem of state design or the distribution of power at the national level. So the last one might be the easiest to see. But the argument here is that this is where we see regionalism. We see regionalism in the European Union, regionalism in very unequal countries like UK or Spain or indeed the United States. And we see, a kind of isomorphic or similar kinds of politics playing out within African countries. So those are the main lines of argument. So I forgot to say at the beginning, please do just raise your hand if you want me to clarify something. Yeah. So here, okay, all that was the warm up. Now I just very briefly. This is the outline. So I just briefly describe inequality in African countries. Actually, this part's quite similar to what I said when I was here 5 years ago. Deepen a little bit the argument about regional inequality and institutions. Just touch briefly on this generic features of regionalism in regionally unequal countries with territorial institutions, and then just briefly kind of show you the way with the other people I worked on in this project, developed an evidentiary base for the argument, and then finally coming to some implications. So this, I showed this slide before, but I really love this slide. This is not my data, but on the left we have world regions and the Gini index from 1980 to 2011. So that is this one. So the light blue line toward the bottom is Europe, mostly. The black line is the so-called advanced economies, or OECD, so that is low. Regional inequality interpersonal income inequality is low. The top is Latin America, okay, but the red line, second from the top, is African countries. So that is interpersonal income inequality evolving over time. So it's super high. So this is how we get this factoid that sub-Saharan Africa is the most unequal or second most unequal region of the world in terms of income inequality. So that we know, and that this other figure is just kind of complementary, but it's also super interesting. So the horizontal axis is GDP per capita, and the vertical one is the net Gini. It's for 2014, but the red dots are African countries. So you see the red blob to Yeah, the left is most African countries. So what you see is as the African country, the wealthier African countries, as you move to the right, are also super, super unequal. And the huge red cloud at the top of the figure. Obviously, so South Africa would be is probably the highest red dot. So the other thing, though, to know is about spatial inequality or regional inequality. So this is the point I want to make. So the horizontal is a measure of regional inequality within countries. So it is, you have a regional GDP proxy, which is nightlight, very imperfect. And you just measure the coefficient of variation in nightlight across the region. So it's kind of spatial inequality across regions as proxy by nightlight. And then the vertical, again, is the interpersonal income inequality. So these blue dots are African countries. So this is around 2012. The blue dots are African countries. So the main point of this slide is this big cloud of blue dots that is high on spatial inequality. So the UK is the gold diamond down here toward the crossing of the axis, the point of origin. I can't say it very well. Imagine I have a pointer. So the UK is there, and a lot here. This is the UK is here. So we know spatial inequality is a big deal within the UK, but there you have it. This here is Spain, and a lot of the comparative political economy literature on territorial inequality, spatial inequality within OECD countries in political sciences on Spain. The US is around here, somewhere in this blob. And China is somewhere around here too. And here, the other orange diamonds are other countries that are Suriname, Indonesia, and others known for literature for countries having high inequality across provinces. So high spatial, geographic spatial inequality. So the point here, well, high spatial inequality within African countries. So the next idea here is, well, so African countries are super high in interpersonal income inequality, and they're super high when you measure spatial or territorial inequality. So I pull from the comparative politics literature this argument that the structure of representation and government or governance shapes the way the inequalities get experienced by people and the way they're expressed in politics, or the way politics structures expressions of inequality. So the comparative politics literature tells us that when institutions are strong, institutions of representation and government are strongly territorial, this tends to bring the geographic inequalities to the fore. And, obviously the United States, unfortunately, is an archetypical example of that. But I use this argument to help make the argument about why spatial or geographic inequality is really high or salient, politically salient, and manifest in African countries. So this vertical axis is supposed. So my project is based on 12 African countries. So actually, there's not a lot of systematic variation within my sample on these two dimensions. So most of what I say kind of basically applies to all of them. But I tried to get some analytic traction on this variable and say, well, some African countries do have more markedly territorial structures of government and representation than others, and those are, on the top half of the 2 by 2, strongly territorial institutions. And, in that cell 1, so high spatial inequality with strongly territorial institutions is cell 1, that's Kenya's, we were talking about before, and these are kind of archetypical cases where you would expect to see really strong regionalism within national politics. So if we go down here to cell 3, it's true, Tanzania, but stronger central institutions, weaker regional or local institutions. region. So the argument here would be that regionalism attenuated in mainland Tanzania. And I'm going to say something here, cell 4, about South Africa, which is the one country of the 12 that I studied or included in the set of analysis in this book. The South Africa kind of stands apart. So of course South Africa is different in a lot of ways. We're not really trying to totally explain South African politics, but when you just consider these crude dimensions, South Africa sort of parses out as expected, and indeed that would be the case where class and class-like politics would be much more salient, but it, as predicted by its values on these variables. So this is the institutional part, and so I won't dwell on this slide, but this is kind of to say, you know, the literature on national economic integration and modernization, if I can say, it's just descriptively predicts under these conditions, when you have sort of building national markets under very different and unequal regions, we expect to see these kinds of politics, core periphery politics, differentiation across the rural regions, a politics of leading and lagging regions, and then this prediction, the economically leading region is likely to be the political core as well. So it's kind of a generic prediction to emerge from the literature. And then, you know, repeating again, these are the policy domains where you would expect regional politics to be very visible. So, you know, quoting here, just Lipset and Roken, which, you know, if you ever did sociology or political science as an undergraduate, you would know. Bensel's analyses of national economic integration in the United States. So sort of this is kind of what you would get, you know, from this literature. And so what I'm doing in this book is kind of saying, you know, perhaps, you know, we shouldn't be super surprised to see this kind of politics emerging within African countries. So on the evidence, so there's kind of two legs on the evidentiary strategy. So one is kind of the history, institutions, and the economic geography, which I would like to say a few words about. And the second is electoral geography, which I'll come to in a second. So on the history and economic geography, so there's just an argument about how integration into the world economy as export producers, you know, most African colonies were export crop producers or labor-sending regions is supporting export crop producers, a few mineral exports. But this uneven integration in the colonial period is really where this economic geography is set. Uneven integration into the world economy. But this happens within the territorial grid of the colonial state. So the argument basically, like institutions are, that the institutions are endogenous to the formation of this kind of economy because the colonial powers shaped the regions around the uneven economic geography. So in the West African colonies, countries, you have a cocoa region, a coffee region, or in Black, tobacco region, or, you know, in Kenya, coffee tea region. So they shape the provincial map around the producer regions, precisely because they were targeting different kind of government, or more intense, if you want, a more intense provision of roads and regulation, etc., to the export producing region. So the territorial grid overlays the economic geography and the political grid, because then politics under colonial rule is the politics, you know, of, in the 20s and 30s, part of kind of the politics of the native authorities, right, the ethnic units. Then when we get to the struggle for independence, politics as the independence parties, the nationalist parties form, scales up to the provincial level, the admin one level, something that the colonial powers actually never wanted. They wanted politics at the district level or lower. But at any rate, so it's this territorial grid of representation and economy sort of they overlay each other. And then there's an argument, I know, in political science we don't really like persistence because they like change, but there is persistence over time. So the institutional grid really does persist over time, and I will show you our boundary analysis. And the economic geography, of course, it changes somewhat, and we should talk about that afterwards if you want. But the economic geography does not radically transform. So this sort of taps into the argument that is sort of basic, factoid, applicant economies have not undergone profound structural transformation since the late colonial period. So the persistence argument is kind of cast at that level. So the institutions and the economic geography largely persist. That is why this map remains salient. So we did, with respect to this institutional persistence thing, and I actually think for political science this is the most important finding, if I can say that. Anyone who actually knows the countries knows this is true, but I don't think anyone ever studied it. So it's boundary persistent analysis. So we took a couple countries like this and looked at the boundaries of districts and native authority areas and trace out those maps and then overlay a map of current administrative structures at the district level. And you can see that the districts have largely persist. The big colonial provinces got broken up, but the subunits they contained persist. They contained native authorities and districts, and these remain intact. So there's an amazing extent of the extent of boundary persistence is amazing, including at the electoral constituency level. So the units persist, and as we know, and we do a little bit of analysis about this, but I won't show the economic geography still largely persists. So this is what I said before. So you have this grid of territorial representation, and the parties in the 1950s have formed within this grid. So they aggregate up to the main parties aggregate up to the provincial level, and they do so most effectively in the export-producing regions because they're integrated, they're the wealthiest, they're the most plugged in. These are the leading regions in the colonial economy. So this is the era of the formation of party systems in African countries, which turns out to be, in many, and in the 12 countries that I study for this project, largely persistent over time. So that's an argument about persistence. So that's the economic geography and institutional side. And then here is where we do something more systematic with electoral geography. So I had to put the picture of like Osaka, Juliet, Cresta, and Bucco, who did all of the data analysis here. But so we asked, it is partisan representation regional, partisan competition regional. And so we took these 12 countries that had electoral competition, more or less competitive elections, but since the 1990s, since we don't have data from the earlier period, although somebody could reconstruct it. And we did an electoral geography analysis. So we looked at where the constituencies were clustering together and sticking together over time across repeated elections. So like Zambia and Malawi have had 6 or 7 elections since the 90s, and Kenya has as well. The 12 countries in our analysis had 3 or more elections that we could track over time. So we looked for constituencies that tend to vote together with high vote shares, like 70 or 80% the people in these neighboring constituencies all voting for the same candidate. So that's a cluster. So once we got the cluster, we said, okay, well, what's going on within these clusters? Are they rich or poor regions, leading or lagging regions? So we did the nightlight analysis, and we used the demographic and health surveys to see if they were leading in terms of educational advantage. We used the DHS to see if they were mono-ethnic or not. And then, we did another part of the analysis, sort of overlay these regional electoral clusters with the colonial admin boundaries and the colonial economic geography to see, to substantiate or provide evidence for this argument that there is this kind of overlaying of the electoral and economic map within the territorial grid of the state, and that it persists. So I mentioned we did 12 countries, and this is just 8 of them, and so we produced these kind of maps of the electoral clustering. And so just to talk about Kenya, since we started there, this is the map of Kenya. So you see in Kenya, there's 4 clusters. So the different colors don't really mean more or less. They're just supposed to be different shades of blue. But you do see here, this is Rigathi Gachagua's central Mount Kenya region electoral block. So what this means is that these constituencies tend to stick together 70% or more for the same candidate over 5 of the 7 last presidential elections. And then these other regions, so here's the Rift in the Rift Valley region also is an electoral block by this definition. That is Ruto's base. And then the West is a block too. And then in Kenya, like all these other, can you see this pointer? Yeah, like all these other countries, you see 50 or 60% of the national territory or of the constituencies are not clustering. So they're not blocks, or they are non-block constituencies. So this is where a constituency is voting in whatever they're doing, but they're not voting in the same way. They're really split. The votes may be very split, and or they're not in sync with their neighbors. So there's no regional block in that sense. So we saw that across the countries. So here's Côte d'Ivoire. This is South Africa, so there's kind of a regional pattern there that people will recognize. This is Uganda. Here's Museveni's stronghold. You see all up this back spine of western Uganda. Here's Zambia. So people who know these countries might not be very surprised by the basic idea. Yeah.
Sorry, could you just repeat what the shaded area represents?
So the shaded areas are clusters of that come persistent electoral blocks. So the units are electoral constituencies. So where you see the block, it means those the members of the block have voted for most 70% above vote share with the other members of the bloc in most of the elections, 60 or 70% of the elections since 1990. So it's like in the U.S., like you and I think we see them here too, but we would have like red and blue states and blocking. So our innovation, although after we did this, I saw a few other people done in other places. We kind of made a composite over time. So we sort of took a snapshot, you can imagine, snapshot of the 5 to 6 elections, and we overlaid those, and we pulled out for what you see here is those constituencies that are almost always or in the block 5 to 7 times for 6, 5 to 7 or 4 to 6 times, or 2 or 3, and I have buckies. So it's a block. So the dark blue ones are block, but the light blues are also blocks. We just made up colors. I hope it's not misleading we tried different colors, but it didn't look good. So we made them all blue, but the blue does not really, it's not explicitly designed to reflect the intensity. So these are the electoral blocks. So I see I'm running out of time. This is some of the things that we found out about the blocks. And so there are 36 blocks, as it were, across the 12 countries. So most of them are economically advantaged regions, as expected. Most of them overlap with the colonial era export producing regions. Most retain that specialization, that economic specialization as regions today. rankings of the bloc in terms of the economic hierarchy in almost all the countries are very stable. So the richest one, for when we have data from 1990, is still or I say richest, the leading one, the most economically advantaged one in 1990 is still the most economically advantaged today. And, you know, a lot of these we just know from what we know about these countries, those were indeed the economically advantaged regions in the 50s and 60s. Most of them do overlap with the colonial era provincial units, and most are really multi-ethnic. And it's because of the scale at which they are clustering. I mean, that's one of the reasons, but most are multi-ethnic. So the national patterns is, you know, when we look at who's winning elections over time since the 90s, the economically leading blocs are usually in power, with a few exceptions as noted there. But, you know, Kenya would be a perfect example of that, although the current regime is an anomaly and in a terrible power struggle. So in elections, we see this coalition pattern where the contending blocs, as represented by their parties, usually don't, like you rarely see two electoral blocs coming together to win. And in that sense, the Regati, Gachagua, Ruto is a little anomalous. Usually the leading ones pick up the other votes they need from the non-bloc constituencies, like these, let's say, politically unorganized or non-regional coalitions like this, kind of isolated electoral constituencies. The opposition parties, this is kind of a logical implication of what I just said, the opposition parties are usually also in the leading leading regions. So among us, they dominate over the regions where you don't see the electoral blocs. And then the final point is about issues which I'll come back to. So I'm gonna skip. This is kind of an illustration of the relationship between the central bloc and the western bloc in Kenya. It's just one of the ways we displayed the data showing, you know, how much dispersion there was. But in nightlight and education, I'm gonna skip. We can come back. Here's the policy, and when I started working on this, as I alluded to at the beginning, I turned to work of Tom Ladders and Sam Hickey and others from Manchester who have worked a lot on the politics of redistribution in African countries. So here, I mean, the redistribution, so I argue that as in Spain and, you know, countries around the world, the US even, this tension between leading and lagging regions is indeed predicted to produce, overlaid by territorial political representation, produce low enthusiasm for redistributive social and other fiscal policies. So, and that is what we see in African countries, so this low redistribution equilibrium, where the bleeding advantaged regions are very non-keen to see their relative advantage diffused or dissipated through subsidy of the lagging regions. And, you know, that's kind of a classic pattern that we see around the world. So South Africa somehow, with like super high redistribution, by main standards, is kind of a counterfactual to this in the African context. But that is indeed predicted by a very different economic structure and a different structure of territorial representation. So by contrasting, you know, the other cases in our sample to the South African case, we kind of get leverage on this issue about the controversiality of redistributive social policies in these countries with high spatial inequality and strong territorial representation. So Africa just fits the international pattern very straightforwardly. And then another argument we make is the high salience of geographically targeted sectoral policy, and that we saw in the Kenya example. And we have lots of examples in the larger book about the, you know, electoral salience of sectoral policy, like the electoral salience of coffee in Kenya. So this is the last slide. So the first points just summarize what I said. So we have this uneven development, gives rise to regional cleavages, shapes national politics in some of the ways that I described, but in ways that are predictable given sort of these basic facts about spatial inequality and strongly territorial institutions. On the implications, I think, besides being a different way of reading the story of national politics and a different way indeed of understanding ethnic politics, it does suggest that these regional dimensions of policy are highly salient in the settings of African countries for the reasons that are really not very difficult to understand. It puts a premium on trying to understand these regional dynamics in trying to explain some of the challenges of policy. So like in the European Union and like in the US under Biden, the sunsetting of the Biden regime, is national cohesion policies that try to sort of balance across the regions are very important for national political stability, even though in these settings, for better or for worse, this is precisely where it's very, very hard to get, endogenously, to get this kind of policy. So thank you for listening to that long talk. That's it.